Hi, welcome to Peg Talk, sponsored by Founded on Truth. I'm your host, Peg Luksik, and in the next 30 minutes or so, we are going to be exploring the issues of the day using a factual approach. There won't be any hyperbole, and whenever possible, I'm going to give you the actual documents so that you can see what I saw when I got the information that I'm about to share with you. And now, without further ado, let us begin. The Articles of Confederation had proven to be a failure. So we needed to change to a new form of government. In moving from Form A to Form B, the U.S. Congress, under the Articles, one chamber, actually met, and in February of 1787 said there are defects in the Articles. And so we're going to create a convention of delegates who will meet in Philadelphia to revise the Articles and to create a federal constitution that will be able to deal with the problems and the needs of this brand new country. So the delegates under the Articles actually voted in their own proceedings to legally create a convention to revise the Articles and create a new constitution. It's kind of unheard of in the history of government for one government to basically vote to replace itself. But because the delegates were loyal to the principles of the Declaration, that's exactly what they did. The Federal Convention convened in Philadelphia in 1787, and there's actually records, and you can read what happened. Now, there are a number of people who gave accounts. Mr. Madison's account is considered the most complete, but there were a number of folks involved in the proceedings who gave accounts. They were supposed to meet on May 14th, and when the delegates came together, they didn't have a quorum. They didn't have enough. So nothing actually happened until May 25th, when a quorum of delegates were available to vote on any actions. And so on May 25th, they unanimously elected George Washington as the president of the convention. And then they decided that all proceedings of the convention would be kept secret during the time that the convention was happening. They did not want leaks. They did not want anything anybody was saying being reported in the press. Therefore, nobody was grandstanding or looking for headlines, nor would anyone feel uncomfortable about anything that they said because it might be reported in the newspapers the next day, so that there could be a free and open discussion among the delegates about what system of government they wanted to put together. The very first thing that happened was that Governor Randolph, who came from Virginia, got up and gave a long explanation of how the Articles of Confederation were not strong enough to protect the peace and safety and security of the nation. And then he listed all the things that were wrong with the Articles of Confederation, which then led to a debate over how do we design a government that is strong enough to protect the Union, but not so strong that it will trample on the states and on the citizens. They were looking for balance. They weren't looking for an overarching national government that would replace the overarching national government that they had just left in England. So the delegates were looking for a balance, and in that search was where many of their dialogues and sort of differences arose. By the end of June, they were in total deadlock. The big states wanted all voting to be based on population. The little states wanted all voting to be based just one state, one vote, and they could not agree. And so that they were almost to the point of dissolving when Benjamin Franklin took the floor. And when he took the floor, he said, in this situation of the assembly, groping in the dark, to figure out how to make this happen, why haven't we been asking God to help? Why have we not been humbly applying to the Father of Lights to illuminate our understandings, Mr. Franklin said. In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence, we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings, that except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this, and I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we shall become a reproach and a byword down to future ages. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter from this unfortunate instance despair of establishing governments by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the existence of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business. Now, Mr. Franklin was very old at this point, and so he actually wrote what I just read to you, handed it to one of the other delegates, and had them read it in his behalf, and then handed his original note to Mr. Madison, who incorporated it verbatim into his recordings of the proceedings. So when folks talk about separation of church and state, and that the founding fathers did not invoke God, they are sadly mistaken. In fact, Mr. Franklin went out of his way to remind the assembly that unless the Lord is involved, we labor in vain. This is a nation that was founded on a belief in God's providence and in his care for us. As the convention went on, they eventually solved their differences. And by September, they were ready to present to the states the final form of the United States Constitution. And on September 17th of 1787, the actual words of the Constitution were written, voted on by the delegates, and signed by George Washington, which is the document that we see in the Library of Congress today. What did it say? It began by saying, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America." That preamble throughout our history has been memorized by school students in every state. Sadly, in modern America, that is no longer the practice, and that's very sad. Now, interestingly, the words "we the people" were put in because no one knew if every state would ratify it, and they didn't want to list a state before ratification. So the words "we the people" were actually a pragmatic consideration in creating the preamble, instead of listing each individual state. The document, the Constitution in Article 6, says that there shall be no religious litmus test as a qualification to hold office in the United States. That was a direct response to the oath of supremacy in England. You remember the one in 1559 under Queen Elizabeth that required anyone who wanted to hold office to swear that the crown, whether it was His Majesty or Her Majesty, was the head of all things, not just temporal, but spiritual. And in the U.S. Constitution, freedom of conscience, the freedom to worship and to interact with God by our own personal conscience, was guaranteed, and that no one could make a particular religion a litmus test for holding public office. In other words, before the Constitution, the people were subjects of the king. Our lives and our property belonged to the king. Any representative body convened at the pleasure of the king, and the only way to change things was to revolt. When the Constitution was signed, the people were not the subjects of any ruler. The people were citizens of a nation who had a continual ability to exercise control over the state. Bloody revolution was no longer our only option in order to change the government. So it was a redefinition of the interaction between the government and the folks who lived inside the purview of that government. No longer subjects, but citizens. And that made all the difference. In Article 1, the Constitution said that the House of Representatives could be reelected every second year. Every member of the House of Representatives would stand for reelection every other year. In effect, that gave to the citizens of this country the ability to completely change the government without firing a single shot. If you can change every member of one of the chambers of Congress, you can effectively change the government. And they wrote that ability into the language of the Constitution. It was a bloodless revolution. So the Constitution actually has a provision for revolution written right inside its own language. Article 5 created a process for the people to change the Constitution itself if they didn't deem it to be necessary. You could go through Congress, but the states themselves could change the Constitution. We have implemented that process successfully 27 times in our history. Once, we changed our minds. The 18th Amendment, which prohibited the sale and manufacture of alcohol in the United States, was ratified in January of 1919. The 21st Amendment, which repealed every piece of the 18th, was ratified in December of 1933. So the Constitution allowed the people to change the Constitution and then change it back. Once, it took more than 200 years. The 27th Amendment was introduced in September of 1789. The 27th Amendment says that any law affecting congressional salaries cannot take effect until after the next election cycle. It was not fully ratified until 1992. It took more than 200 years for that amendment to pass, but in fact, it did. And it became the 27th Amendment of the Constitution because the people kept working at it. When the Constitution was ready, there were objections. One of the objections was made by George Mason, and he said there's no Declaration of Rights. The laws of the general government are paramount to the laws of the states. So if the state doesn't have a Declaration of Rights, then there aren't any, and if the federal laws supersede state laws, it's not good enough. So the objections were that there had to be a Declaration of Rights, and many states said we won't ratify the Constitution unless we know that that Declaration of Rights is going to be passed. That became the Bill of Rights, or the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. You notice that the limit's on Congress, not on the church and not on the people. The limit of putting limits on your right to exercise your religion the way that you want is not your limit. It's Congress's limit. And it is not freedom of worship. In other words, what you do inside your church. It's freedom of religion. How you live your life in accord with the dictates of your faith. That means outside the church as well as inside the church. It is a much larger freedom which has been guaranteed. It said Congress cannot abridge the freedom of speech or the press, and it cannot abridge the right of the people to petition the government for grievances. Again, the limit is on the government, not the people, that you are free to speak, to assemble, to seek redress, and you have open access to information. Remember King James I, who said, citizens should not ask grievances of the king if he's already made his decision. The First Amendment says, oh, you absolutely can go back to the government again and again and again to get to address grievances that you may have. The Second Amendment, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's actually pretty clear. Now, did they mean it? Oh, yes, they did. George Mason, who was one of the principal movers to getting a Bill of Rights in the first place, said to disarm the people is the most effective way to enslave them. Well, that's a fairly clear statement. Noah Webster, who was from New England, and he was one of the folks that was leading the debate up in New England on whether or not to ratify the Constitution, said before a standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed, as they are in almost every country in Europe. The supreme power in America cannot enforce unjust laws by the sword, because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops. Remember those three swords? The sword of the state is a sword. Citizens who have the right to defend themselves have the right to do so not just against crime, but against a government that has overstepped its limits. And the founders who wrote this language were very aware of that. James Madison himself said, beside the advantage of being armed, which the Americans possess over the people of almost every other nation, the existence of subordinate governments to which the people are attached and by which the militia officers are appointed forms a barrier against the enterprises of ambition, more insurmountable than any which a simple government of any form can create. The founders absolutely knew what they were doing when they wrote and instituted the language of the Second Amendment and guaranteed that American citizens would never be disarmed and at the mercy of a tyrannical government. The Third Amendment, no soldier shall be quartered without the consent of the owner, except as prescribed by law. That was an exact response to the Quartering Act of the British Parliament. It's an amendment that hasn't been much used in this country because it really hasn't been necessary. But if we need it, it's there. The Fourth Amendment, the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and describing the place to be searched and the person or things to be seized. That's the limits on the government's ability to search you. They can't just come chomping into your house. They have to get a warrant that says why they want to make a search and what will be searched. And the warrant must be approved by a judge. Fourth Amendment is the basis for some of the argumentation today over, is the privacy of your cell phone sacrosanct? Security cameras, drones. Does the government have the right to constantly surveil its citizens? And what are the limits on that right? All of that discussion is taking place within the parameters of the Fourth Amendment. It is an amendment that is incredibly important today to our freedoms. The Fifth Amendment limits your power to prosecute. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime, except there's an indictment. You have the right to, you can't be put on trial twice for the same offense. You can't be compelled to be a witness against yourself. You can't be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. And the government can't take private property for public use without compensation. Many of those provisions we actually found in the Magna Carta, dating all the way back to 1215, that you have the right to a grand jury. You have the right to due process. Double jeopardy is not allowed. You have the right to say, I won't incriminate myself. They can't make you testify against yourself. And if the government does take your property, you have to be compensated for it. That amendment is followed by the Sixth, which says that you will get a speedy and public trial. You will have a jury of your peers. You have to have a right to face your accusers, to know the charges against you. You have a right to a full defense. You have a right to an attorney. Remember, in the conflict between the state and the people, it's always the state and a person. Almost never is the entire body politic lined up against the might of the state. It is one individual. So the Sixth Amendment limits the ability of the government to put you in prison, to act outside of any legitimate mechanism to convict you of a crime. So it says, no, we're going to make sure that the government is severely limited in exercising its authority when it is doing something that might deprive you of your life or your liberty or your property. The Seventh Amendment is the jury trial in civil cases, and it says that the jury verdict is final. In fact, it says that the jury can set aside a law it doesn't like, and that if the jury decides that, then that is the final statement. That a judge cannot override a jury and say, I don't really like what you did, so I'm going to change it. If the jury says it, it's done. The Eighth Amendment, excessive bail may not be required, nor excessive fines, nor cruel or unusual punishments. So the government can't exercise its rights to destroy your wealth or your freedom or your life just because it wants to get even with you. The amendments involving crime and punishment are specifically intended to weigh the scales backwards, because the framers knew when it is the people versus the government, it's always a person. And so it's an attempt to put more weight on the person's scales to help to balance justice, so that government can't just run roughshod over an individual that it may want to prosecute for any reason whatsoever. The Ninth Amendment and the 10th Amendment basically say the federal government can't step beyond the powers that are outlined inside the Constitution, whether it's your individual rights or the rights of the state. That the Constitution specifically outlined what were the duties and the authorities of the federal government, and that if it's not listed in the Constitution, then those authorities belong to the states or to the people themselves. So it's a reiteration of the idea that there are, in fact, limits on the power of the federal government. In effect, the Constitution took the philosophy that Thomas Jefferson outlined in the Declaration of Independence, that three-sword philosophy, endowed by a creator who gave the people rights, and the people institute the government and have the right to control it. The Constitution took that philosophy and created a how-to manual. What does that look like in practice? In practice, America's three swords, as outlined in the Constitution, said the voice of the church is and needs to be independent. The people, through their right to vote, have the ability to change the government completely every 2 years, and by changing the Constitution as they see the need arise, and that those two things together, the founders hoped, would limit the might of the government itself. So they created two swords to draw a fence around the sword that the government held. And as long as we faithfully adhered to the provisions and the limits of the Constitution, it worked pretty well. In the last decade or so, the federal government is working awfully hard to step outside of its limits. Whether it will succeed depends on how willing we are to assert, through the power of the vote and the power to work with the Constitution, to assert the sword that we hold. Just as it was when the Constitution was written, the ultimate authority, and therefore the ultimate responsibility, rests with we, the people, for whom the Constitution was written. Thank you so much for joining us. Again, if you would like to see earlier episodes, please join us at foundedontruth.com, where you will find additional resources, including our book on a parent's guide to selecting reading instruction for their children, Love Mom, which is a book I wrote on the wonder and beauty of parenthood, Mirror Image, exploring how and why every life is sacred. In our upcoming series, we're going to be reading together the Quran to see, what does Islam actually teach? Is it a religion of peace? What does Islam think about women and civil rights and a pluralistic society? So I do hope you join us. And until then, may the good Lord hold you in the palm of his hand.